Other Rooms, Other Wonders by Mary Beth, Andrew, Veronica, and Phil. Other Rooms, Other Wonders by Danielle Manudin is a collection of short stories about the lives of different people living in Pakistan under the rigid class system. Each of their stories comes together to create one large narrative. The stories are not in chronological order, but by the end of the book, the reader gets a full view of life, corruption, and what people do to survive in Pakistan. The rigid hierarchy in Pakistan perpetuates an environment in which the rich dominate the poor and men take advantage of women. The social classes never change because of the corruption in the upper echelons of the system, destroying the concept of social mobility. Manipulation and corruption trickle down, causing the poor and women to use both to survive. In Other Rooms, Other Wonders, each character represents a perspective used by social classes to justify their actions. Danielle Manudin wants the reader to realize the flaws in each class's perspective and see the big picture. The first step to seeing someone else's perspective is knowing that you already have one. Manudin knows this and hopes Pakistan can someday realize this too, taking the first step toward change. Keeping It Classy, an overview of the rigid class system in Pakistan by Phil. The class system enforces strict and thorough adherence to the status quo. The people on top have all the power, and their main concern is how to keep it that way. There are 5 main classes in the Pakistani system. On the very top are the Brahmins, the priests. Next are the Kshatriyas, the warriors and rulers. In the middle are the Vaisyas, skilled traders, merchants, and minor officials. Next from the bottom are the Sudras, or the unskilled workers. On the very bottom we have the pariahs, or Harijans. They are the outcasts, untouchables, otherwise known as the children of God. Brahmins are in charge of religion in Pakistan. They are at the top, but in more recent times hold less direct power. However, their influence remains a very strong factor in Pakistani society today. No women are allowed in this class. Kshatriyas are the ruling class in Pakistan. They make all of the major decisions and have direct power over daily life in Pakistan. The Vaishyas class is comprised of low-ranking officials, skilled workers, and merchants. They are for the most part educated and perform skilled labor. Sudras are the class that perform all kinds of unskilled labor. This class does most of the day-to-day labor required to keep the country running. In Pakistan, women are almost a class of their own. While women do fall into different social classes, their power is not equal to that of men from the same class. In many cases, women can only do the job set aside for them because they are deemed too feminine. As you go up to the class structure, life is better for women, but it really is all dependent on how their husband or father wants to treat them. The pariah class represents the lowest level of Pakistani society. They are given the most menial of tasks and are generally looked on with disdain. Power and Control, an overview of men's tight grip on women in Pakistani society by Veronica Cook. Manipulation can be found all throughout Pakistan because of class differences that exist between men and women. Men are found to be viewed as higher status than women in Pakistan even if they have the same amount of possessions. Men will still be viewed as higher up the ladder than women just because they are men. Women can be hurt from being denied rights, as well as raped or beaten by their husbands or fathers. To men in Pakistan, women are there for their needs, not as humans, which leads women to need to find alternative ways to succeed. Manudin illustrates how he wrote this way because of all that he has seen from women as they tried to enable power for themselves. Watching this video also helps flow into how manipulation can attribute to corruption.
Of these people, in particular the relationship between men and women, and in the case of many of your interlinked short stories, it's the older men who really prey in a terrifying way on much younger, vulnerable, sadder women.
This is true, but I think just generally women in Pakistan are powerless, more or less. I mean, there are exceptions, of course, but therefore they have to use whatever means are available to them to achieve their purposes. And obviously sex is one of the strongest cards they hold. And work, by definition, if you're looking for powerful men, generally they're older men. You are young and nubile, the object of your affections is older and powerful, and that's a dynamic that I see very much in Pakistan.
Let's talk about sex. An analysis of sex and gender and how they interact in Pakistani society by Mary Beth Davis. This section covers sex in Pakistani society, sex meaning both gender and sexual activity. Not only will this section be covering how gender affects the storyline, but also how men and women use sex to obtain power. This section also discusses how using sex changes a person's perspective based on their gender and how they use sex as a weapon, which can change other people's perspectives. First, let's take a look at the cover of the book. This book cover gives the reader a sense of what the book will hold. The first illustration we see is a picture of a woman sitting in a chair, enjoying her view, and two men hanging over a railing overlooking all the other drawings. This is significant because these photos represent the roles of each gender in the social class system. The woman here is a part of the upper class, but does not oversee the others underneath her. Instead, she is in the class just to look pretty. The men in this class are all powerful and can oversee the other classes to do their bidding. The next drawing we see is two men having a discussion and what seems to be a woman admiring one of the men. This is the middle class section, where the woman is allowed to be a part of the conversation, but she is trying to use her body to persuade the man to her direction. The men in this conversation still have power over the woman because they are blatantly ignoring the girl and know that she will still provide them with sex if she wishes to be in their class. The next illustration is of a man shooting another man. We can tell that one of the gentlemen is of a lower class because of the clothes he has on, and the other is higher because of the clothes he has on. Gender and class play a role in this scene as the men are fighting to keep their positions in society, and the lower class man is trying to gain power by exerting dominance as another male in society. The last drawing shows us a picture of three women doing manual labor. This is the lower class because the women are having to do manual labor to try to survive. At this level, women will do almost anything to make sure they can survive. The following quote illustrates how women in Pakistan use sex as a weapon. The women in these stories often use sex to prey on the men, and they do so with abandon at best and rage at worst. End quote. In this patriarchal, hierarchical society, it is their sharpest weapon. Women in the lower classes sleep their way up, only to just be kicked back down, while those in the upper classes use their feminine influence to maneuver their husbands into ever-growing circles of power, until age corrodes their authority. In this clip, we see the interview ask if the older men really prey on the younger women. Danielle Minuddin replies that, yes, this is the reality of Pakistan, and that women have no power. He shows this in the text with all the women who sleep with men for some type of power. He elaborates that women are also prey on older men because they have what they want, which is power. This can change the perspective of the man that is being used as well because he is trying to please the female in order to get what he ultimately wants. We can see an example where both parties are using each other to get what they want in the story Provide, Provide. Zainab sleeps with Jiglani because she wants children, and when she can't have children, Jiglani, being affected by Zainab's weapon of sex, gives in to her wishes and provides her with a child of his sons.
Landscapes of these people, in particular the relationship between men and women, and in the case of many of your interlinked short stories, it's the older men who really prey in a terrifying way on much younger, vulnerable, sadder women.
This is true. But I think just generally, women in Pakistan are powerless, more or less. I mean, there are exceptions, of course, but therefore they have to use whatever means are available to them to achieve their purposes. And obviously sex is one of the strongest cards they hold. And work, by definition, if you're looking for powerful men, generally they're older men. You are young and nubile. The object of your affections is older and powerful. And that's a dynamic that I see very much in Pakistan.
In this video, the interviewer points out that Danielle Minuddin does not just say what he is wanting to say, he drops hints towards his stories to make the reader come to the conclusion that he wants the reader to see. We can see that throughout the story as he gives little hints about how women have no power, but by the end of the story, we can see how other countries' upbringing can change your perspective on life and how things are seen. An example of this is the story when the character Helen pays her servant a decent amount of money and lets him be buried in their property. This shows that even though Helen was not brought up in Pakistan, and that she can adapt to having servants, though she still treats them as equals. It also shows that her letting his resting place become tarnished is a way the Americanism starts to take her heart, as she loses interest.
One of the things that listening to you I was reminded of was how much I really admire in your work. They're not these sort of huge fireworks, but they're sort of quiet detonations all over the page. And there are ways in which you give us characters just by a little detail. I mean, in that it was full of them. One of my favorite was the man with a trick lighter shaped like a tiny pistol, and you think, that tells me what I need to know about this guy. And it's a very effective way of getting characterization across it. We don't have sort of huge bits of dialogue and huge bits of sort of description. And of course, sorry.
Sorry,
No,
you can finish.
Go.
Yeah. Well, I think that, no, exactly. I'll answer this part and then you can do the next part.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, and I think that's one of the really most fun and also most complicated part of the craft of writing is what's left unsaid, which is what you're speaking about. I mean, fiction is, when you're writing it, and also when you're reading it. When you're writing it, I think fiction is defined by sort of the absences as much as by what's present on the page, because it's such an intense process of selection, that you leave out so much, and so much has to be implied. And I think that's one of the really fun things about fiction and about writing fiction, is that you're creating this world, but it's all sort of smoke and mirrors, because what you're doing is, putting a little piece here and a little piece here, and then letting the reader with his experience and knowledge fill in those parts. And that's what makes reading such a collaborative and an active process, that you don't know what that tehsildar looks like, but you've seen a guy with a trick lighter, and so in your mind, it's not going to be what was in my mind. I've just given you little indications, and then you, very actively working upon this, are going to make those other pieces. And this is, of course, why TV rots your brain, for example, because TV doesn't require you to do any of that. TV, you just sit there and sort of eat your potato chips, and the whole thing happens to you. Whereas fiction, you have to work on it. You're the guy who's doing half the work or more, and so it's better for you. Read more fiction.
The following two quotes perfectly outline the necessity women have to use their sex as a weapon, and how futile it can be. First quote: Salima knew that he was not through with her, would sweeten her up and try to fuck her now and then, out of cruelty as much as anything else, to show he could. Second quote: I also wanted to have a real moment with you, quite snide from Sohail. I respect you, and I envy your freedoms. In your life, you'll have solid things, and you have them more solidly than I did. Salima showing how men knew they could take advantage of women. Salima had been sleeping with the cook to receive special treats from him. Once he had enough of her, then he disposed of her like trash, and moved on to the next slut. He would then go back to her from time to time to show that he had control over her and the other women in his kitchen, just because he was an older man in a higher society. The second quote follows a conversation between Rafia and Helen, Sohail's American girlfriend, about the differences in Rafia growing up and Helen. This quote demonstrates how Americans embrace power and give it to their citizens. Rafia says, I envy your freedoms. These freedoms are being attributed to the woman's upbringings. This shows the difference in the gender and in the role of the class system. Helen, an American lower-class citizen, and Rafia being a Pakistani higher-class citizen, both having a completely different upbringing. Rafia knows that if Helen was to move to Pakistan, then she would not be happy, as she would have to adapt to Pakistani laws regarding women and a class system. Helen, never considering this to be a factor, is completely set aback when this is mentioned. After realizing that this would be the case, then Helen's perspective is changed. In the book Other Rooms, Other Wonders, we can see that sex is not only used as a weapon to obtain needs and wants, but also changes the way both parties involved see things. Gender also affects how a person sees and perceives things, because there is a strict difference in how men and women are treated and given certain rights in Pakistani society. Big Corruption, an overview of corruption in Pakistani society and how it fuels disparity and enforces the rigid social class system, by Andrew Jumper. The rigid social hierarchy that rules in Pakistan is perpetuated by corruption in the upper echelons of the class system. Social mobility is impossible for the poor, and almost equally so for the rich. Everything is about maintaining the status quo. In Pakistan, class is law. Daniel Minuddin has the interesting perspective of being a landowner within the class system and an outside observer of it as well. He's had his own experience with how corruption affects society and uses his book, Other Rooms, to comment on how it has penetrated every aspect of society, creating a stagnant environment. In this section, we'll take a look at what Minuddin has to say on corruption, how it's portrayed in Other Rooms, and how it actually affects life in Pakistan today. Daniel Minuddin uses Other Rooms as a social commentary on Pakistan's rigid social class system. But what prompted him to speak out like this? As a boy, he had everything he could want. He was able to attend primary and secondary school in Pakistan, and post-secondary as well as postgraduate school in America. His early years were paid for by the success of his landowning father and American-Norwegian actress mother. The answer is that he gained a new perspective. Once his father died, he gained control of his farm and witnessed the extreme levels of corruption that plagued business in Pakistan. He also inherited his mother's farm in Wisconsin. He fought hard to regain control of his father's farm from corrupt schemers vying to take it. Growing up, he had seen the feudal ways of landowning in Pakistan and wanted no part in it. He treated his employees the same in both Pakistan and America, but that was not enough for him. He wanted to give everyone the perspective he had gone through so much to achieve. That's why he wrote Other Rooms. In an interview, he said, "I realized that I was in a unique position to write these stories for a Western audience. Stories about the farm and the old feudal ways, the dissolving feudal order, and the new way coming. Corruption is the fuel for disparity in Pakistan, but fuel eventually runs out. Minuddin has hopes that if enough people can gain a new perspective like he did, corruption will begin to be less prevalent in Pakistan, and a new, less rigid order will be attained." In his commentary, Minuddin wants readers to ask, what does the upper class get by operating within such a rigid class structure? It isn't so simple as they get to stay rich and powerful. It goes much deeper than that. Minuddin wants to show that the upper class has a need to feel superior that can only be satisfied by perpetuating a rigid system that separates them from those that they deem inferior. Every shady deal, rip-off, and bribe is fueled by the upper class's need to stay separate. Other Rooms, Other Wonders follows the lives of the rich Haroni family and their servants. The characters fall everywhere along the impossible-to-climb social ladder. Jiglani, an upper-middle-class landowner and trusted manager of KK Haroni, tries to climb it by scamming his boss and using his position to gain political influence. However, when he falls ill, the tables turn. The members of the class he aspires to attain destroy his hopes and pride, waiting for him to die so they can control his assets. In the lower class, a character known as Nawab the Electrician siphons electricity off his boss, KK, just enough so that nobody would notice. He does not advance in society, however. If he were to aspire to take more than that, he would be crushed by his uppers. In another story, a woman is burned alive by her family, but the only thing police officials are concerned about is how much money they can extract from the situation. The judge is only concerned with who can pay the police to find out the truth, and his wife only cares about finding a replacement for the servant falsely imprisoned for the crime. As the New York Times article puts it, motion in Pakistani society, be it social or moral, can only be horizontal. Minuddin uses the characters in the story to illustrate how hopeless this social climate is because of the rigid hierarchical class structure and corruption. He wants to show how this structure creates a need for corruption to keep it that way, and that the corruption trickles down to the lower classes. The rich use it to stay rich, and the poor use it to survive. So what does corruption look like in Pakistan today? Although Pakistan's situation has improved since Minuddin published his book in 2009, it still suffers from many of the same corruption-related problems outlined in Other Rooms, Other Wonders. Holding tight to the old feudal ways, rich landowners and politicians form cohorts in order to keep the poverty levels high in rural areas, making deals with each other to keep the power and the land in the same hands. They line their pockets with government money, while making sure the lower classes do not receive living wages. Pakistan consistently ranks Transparency International's list among the top corrupt countries of the world, ranking 79 out of 91 countries at the time of Other Rooms publishing, making it more corrupt than 86% of the world. Today, it sits at rank 116 out of 176 countries sampled, making it more corrupt than 65% of the world. Definitely an improvement, but Pakistan's lower class is still devastated by the effects of corruption. We still have a long way to go. It is no question that big corruption hurts Pakistan in very tangible ways today. The power sector, exports and imports, judicial, emergency response, education, healthcare, land distribution, and police are all examples of how corruption directly impacts Pakistan today. According to Umbreen Javed's extensive study, whenever corruption puts money into the pockets of one person, it usually takes away from funding used for public services. Vast amounts of money that could be used to help the disparity problem is lost in Pakistan due to bribery and other forms of corruption. The overall poverty rate in Pakistan is just below 39%, according to the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, or OPHI. However, as this map shows, the more rural parts of Pakistan in the west, in the red, are most affected by poverty. Notice that Lahore, in the north, has a poverty rating of about 10%. Remember, that's where KK Haroni lives in Other Rooms, Other Wonders. This is how rich landowners control the poor in Pakistan. They keep the rural regions in check while making sure it does not affect their own lives, living in their own sort of bubble, according to Shehzad. Shehzad's scathing analysis of Pakistan notes how, quote, laws are enacted to protect the interests of feudal lords. When these are not served, the same laws are broken to ensure the elite's interests are protected, end quote. This is the kind of corruption Dania Minuddin wants people to be aware of. To conclude, in a perfect Pakistan, the social class structure would not be so rigid and hierarchical. Members of the upper class would not have the power to manipulate the poor, and women would not feel the need to use sex as a weapon to obtain basic things. The poor would not have to resort to corruption to survive, and the rich would not use corruption to keep control. However, that is not how things are. Both parties' perspectives are very one-sided, as perspectives often are. Rich men disregard the poor, focusing on their money and land deals, and take advantage of women. The poor and women do what they can to survive, sometimes using sex to get what they want or need, sometimes siphoning off resources not entitled to them, or sometimes stealing food or ripping each other off in a deal. In this not-so-perfect Pakistan, the poor and women lose out, but nobody truly wins. It is Minuddin's hope that, in time, Pakistan will develop a perspective that affords for human decency and equality, a nation all can be proud of.